Hi, I'm Peter Gordon, and I'm here with Christine Williams at Mary Queen of the Apostles Parish here in Salem, Massachusetts.
Hi, I'm Christine. I am the head of the healing ministry here at Mary Queen of the Apostles, as well as a licensed psychologist practicing on the North Shore of Boston.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background with being a psychologist? Like, what kind of counseling do you do? What kind of areas do you specialize in, and so on?
I'm a licensed counseling psychologist, and I have been practicing now, including with my master's degree, for about 18 years. But I've been in the Salem area, first in college counseling and now in private practice for the past 13. Broadly, I focus on trauma and working with individuals who have experienced either what we call big T trauma, so very significant and impactful life events, or also little t trauma, so things that maybe don't rise to the level of an assault or a war, but things that are very impactful towards people's lives. More recently, and this relates a little bit more to the healing ministry, I have also developed a subspecialty in terms of working with people with religious trauma, as well as sort of the intersection of spirituality and counseling.
Oh, interesting. How did you get into that connection, and how did you get into healing ministry?
Well, I'm a lifelong Catholic, but I was definitely a psychologist first, and throughout my training program, I was actually away from church. And when I came back to faith about 9 years ago, I got really involved in a program called Alpha, which is the primary tool that we use for evangelization here in the parish. And one of the things in the Alpha program that teaches people kind of in an open and very welcoming way about Jesus, one of the things in there is about praying for people and healing. So in some of the first retreats that we ran here, I was just asked to pray with people, and I didn't really know exactly what that meant. I understood praying for people, so I just kind of did my best. But then I discovered it was actually something that felt really spiritually fruitful for me, and I really enjoyed doing it, so I kind of continued in the context of the Alpha program. But then when our pastor, Father Murray, came to the parish, he had been involved in an even greater and more established sort of healing ministry, and talked to me about it just with my background in terms of intercessory prayer, but also as a therapist, and got me involved more and more in healing ministry stuff.
So in that work where you're sometimes doing counseling, sometimes doing some more spiritual work and praying over people, what are some of the similarities and what are some of the differences between those two types of ministry?
It's a great question, and one for me that is increasingly difficult to differentiate. So maybe starting with the similarities is best. We know from the counseling literature that the things that make counseling effective are to have a warm, open and non-judgmental relationship developed between a helper and the person who's seeking help. We know that having an environment that is set up for healing is a huge and important part of that. And also having, kind of a formal sense of process. And so a thing that a person goes through to achieve health or wellness. And so the interesting thing is, when I put on my hat as a psychologist, and especially if I'm working with a person who doesn't have a faith background or who isn't bringing that into the work, we don't talk about spirituality or pray with one another necessarily. And it is just talking about the things going on in their life and processing through that to provide healing. When it comes to healing ministry, all of those conditions actually apply, which is why the field of psychology is increasingly aware of the benefits of faith communities, because there is so much overlap about what makes the conditions where healing can happen. Now, that being said, there are techniques that are very specific to therapy, especially in terms of trauma and relational work, that are kind of in that camp. And on the healing side, there are different techniques that look more at the spiritual themes and really get in and use prayer and use kind of a spiritual approach for things. So those two things look different. But interestingly, with my clients who do identify as Christian and bring it into the work, we can shift back and forth sometimes between the model of healing, because they do look pretty similar sometimes.
No. Ultimately, a similarity between healing prayer and counseling is the first thing is having a relationship.
Yeah.
People need to feel comfortable speaking with you.
Right.
Just like if they were to, come for healing, they need to be able to be comfortable speaking about their issues with you, or with the healing team or whatever. Or if they need some really deep healing, they need to be able to sit down and talk with somebody about what those issues are.
Yeah.
That relationship ends up being key.
Right.
People today are a little bit more comfortable with the idea of going to some psychologist that they never met.
Right.
They'll have one or two conversations with and say, okay, yeah, I want to work with you.
So, and this is the thing. It's interesting because I think when people think about psychotherapy and they think about how a therapist might come into a session, they are presuming something that we're trained on, which is a relationship which feels comfortable and taking sort of a non-judgmental stance towards the person who has come into the room. And people are assuming going into a spiritual place, a faith-based kind of pastoral care setting or confession, that the relationship is judgmental and that the relationship is very specifically to point out wrongs and to condemn.
Yeah.
And so I think that is why people are more open to going to speak to a counselor versus a priest or even, a clergy member of different faith communities. But many times that's not accurate, especially as the church, especially the Catholic Church, has gotten better at training its priests, helping them grow spiritually, helping them understand their role as spiritual fathers. The priesthood has really come a long way in terms of training its men how to sit one-on-one with individuals, how to talk to the person, address their humanity, understand the nature of doing wrong and needing to do better. The reality of our theology as Catholics is that it is actually incredibly gentle towards the development of the human person and incredibly coaching of making progress slowly over time, but that's not what is often portrayed in the media at all. And it's not necessarily the way that most Catholics or even most priests approach moral development or the moral theology of our faith.
Yeah, I can see that as just my own personal experience. I grew up in the Catholic faith and I felt like, okay, it was a bunch of rules and a bunch of behavioral expectations. They're sort of like, here are these moral guideposts and are you doing, are you good or you bad or not?
Yeah.
And didn't really ever get this sense of there's this growth that God is drawing us along and that he's trying to transform us as we're willing. And as part of it is just being willing and recognizing, trying to see what in our own lives, what he already sees. So yeah, that's that. I didn't grow up with that. So I wanted to get back to something you mentioned as we were talking about your practice, and that's the kinds of problems that you see people dealing with a lot today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I think the things that people bring to counseling and the things that they're bringing to healing prayer overlap significantly. When we do the smaller prayer sessions with individuals and versus like when I do an intake with a client coming in for counseling, it usually sounds pretty much the same. Something I think that a lot of people deal with more than we realize is having some form of trauma or relational trauma in their background. So whether that be a history of abuse in childhood, some kind of assault or difficulty, with military service or something in adulthood, or just a pattern of kind of relational damage, disrupted relationships or chaotic families is something that a lot of people experience and a lot of people bring to both therapy and to counseling. I think the other thing that we're seeing a lot these days, a couple of things in terms of a sense of isolation, just because of where we are in terms of technology, how the world moved through kind of the first years of the COVID pandemic, and then also a sense of hopelessness. And so questions about how can things get better? Is the world sort of too broken or too hostile, or are people too divided? And so this sense that things are going wrong and worries that things maybe can't go right.
So if someone's coming to you as a counselor and they're saying, well, they feel very isolated, they feel lonely or something like that, separated from friends, family, or whatever, how would you deal with that as a psychologist on the one hand, and then how would that be different from how you would deal with it from the sort of healing prayer context?
I think the basis of psychotherapy that a lot of people don't realize is, coming into sort of the healing setting and forming a therapeutic relationship with a therapist. Isolation's an interesting one because you're coming into relationship with a person, and as they're sharing their story, talking about the isolation, getting that support, we're actually in the middle of an intervention, reducing isolation because they're connecting with another human. Now, even though it's, kind of paid and it's a formal setting, you're already relieving that sense of being alone in the world or not feeling like a person can connect. But then as they're going through the story, the power and the healing nature of telling another person your story and getting support and actually having another person care enough to listen. Psychologist Carl Rogers once posed that if everyone simply had people in their life who would listen and would genuinely care, that we generally wouldn't need psychotherapy, because that is such an important part of what we do. So with isolation, it could be as simple as coaching a person into how to explore and get out of the house more. It's hard to make adult friends, and if you were used to making friends in grade school and middle school, high school, and college, where they're all just right there, maybe it's just a skills thing. But for other people, it could be hard work of healing trauma related to relationships not feeling safe, or it could be something along the lines of feeling too anxious to talk to other people that would maybe take us down a whole different set of techniques, like learning how to manage physical anxiety or panic. And so that could be sort of the approach from the psychological standpoint. Now, with the healing standpoint, it's interesting because it kind of starts out the same. When we're working with a person in the healing team, they're coming into a session and they're telling their story. And so the initial thing of feeling a little less isolated because there's a caring set of people who are listening and engaging with them is the same. But then the second piece of it becomes a little bit different, and this is sort of the what you do with the story in psychology versus healing. In the healing part of it, what we do is we consider the spiritual realm of things. There's healing that needs to take place, and so we will talk about sort of the spirits that are attached to something, the need for forgiveness of oneself or others, and rejecting lies. And so we might lead a person through renouncing a spirit of isolation.
One of the things I noticed on social media is there are a lot of people who post videos where they will characterize somebody else's behavior as either a red flag, or it's toxic, or they're entitled, or, oh, this is a narcissist, or, oh, they don't have good boundaries, or I need boundaries with this person. Or they might use some other ism, like, oh, that's racism, that's sexism, that's whatever. It's this kind of judging behavior of characterizing somebody else's behavior as negative. What do you think of that trend?
Yeah, one of my favorite faculty members in grad school always answered everything with "it depends," which after the first 3 semesters got pretty annoying. I think it depends. I think one of the reasons that I really appreciate those conversations happening on social media is because it is bringing light to something that we believe very strongly as Christians, which is that people deserve to be treated well, and that it is always appropriate to, look at another person, and if they're hurting you, to say, like, hey, this hurts me, or I don't like that behavior. And so in that sense, I think it's good, because there's two extremes in this world that people can go to that fall into the kind of ineffective behavior. One is not knowing how to protect themselves against hurt and letting people hurt them, people pleasing, sort of giving up their own humanity or their own dignity for people who maybe don't deserve it, who shouldn't be trusted. The other end of the spectrum is people who are kind of taking that a little bit too far and using others only for their own benefit, or not treating their friends or their family humanely, maybe engaging in those red flag behaviors. But I would also propose a counter to that, because there is a lot of conversation about, well, those people are narcissists, or that person is engaging in a red flag behavior. And I think as Christians, in an era of compassion and forgiveness, we call a sin a sin. We don't call something good that is bad, but we also kind of wonder about why with compassion. A lot of times things people identify as a red flag behavior or narcissism are actually the results of trauma and wounds in the person that is engaging in the behavior that is hurtful. And so to write a person off just as a narcissist, or to write a person off as a box of red flags, sometimes it is a person that you need to distance yourself from, but we want to remember the humanity of the person on the other side that is doing something hurtful, because hurt people tend to hurt people. And so there's probably a reason that that person also needs healing, although it can be a little bit harder to accept, and you may not be ready to move into even being able, or it being appropriate to care if you're the person being hurt. So I'm glad the conversations are happening, but I think we need to be a little bit more diplomatic about considering everyone as being in a place of growth, and everybody as kind of hopefully moving along a path to engaging in healthy relationship behaviors.
Whatever issues you have, whatever issues I have, we kind of have to acknowledge them and work with them. I don't know, maybe it sounds a little bit idealistic, but
that is how healthy people in healthy contexts absolutely operate and should be operating. For a person who is healing and another person who is healing, hopefully they're able to move more together across time. Ultimately, from that Christian standpoint, we are bringing people together instead of cordoning off people who are bad or field hospital. And so a church that's a field hospital is presuming that we're wounded, and that's just the reality of the situation. Whether it's us as lay people or the clergy, we're all working through things and on a journey, is what I would want a person in that space to know.
One other thing I wanted to ask you about is, why would someone want to kind of go through this examination of conscience we've been talking about for over Lent, and then there's this day that we're planning of having confessions, having healing prayer, and so on at the church? If someone's feeling like, okay, I have some issues and problems I'm working through, they may already be seeing somebody for counseling and therapy. Why would somebody want to go to confession on top of that, or experience healing prayer on top of that? What's the point? Why would somebody want to do it?
Yeah, well, there's a whole set of theological reasons why confession is important, but I think what I want to do is actually really answer that from the standpoint of, even from a secular psychologist standpoint, of why would that be important? And confession still could feel like torture. I know I always get nervous going to confession. It's not my favorite thing to do until I get in there and get to the end. But what you're doing is you're giving yourself the opportunity to sit with another person, working with a priest that you trust, and to really have the chance to think about what it is in your life that you want to work on, that you want to do differently, that you might feel a sense of sadness about having done. And to be able to actually name that, whether it's in counseling or confession, when we're able to name something, we're really able to take control of it and kind of see it objectively and start to make change. So outside of the sacrament and the whole economy of grace and having sin forgiven, we're also engaging in an amazingly useful practice to sit with a person who hears us and accepts us and, in sacramentally on Jesus's behalf offers forgiveness, but also in their own humanity doesn't reject us and shows us care and shows us comfort. And so some people will say, well, I can express my sins directly to God, and in other Christian traditions, that's how it works. There's no confession, but the experience can actually be really powerful if you can get beyond the fear and get into the courage. And then with the healing prayer, we genuinely believe that there is a chance for spiritual healing. And so even though you've talked about the same thing in counseling, to then also take it to prayer and renounce it or reject that and to get the grace. A lot of people will say they experience a very deep sense of peace and a sense of calm, which is something that I don't, having worked in both models, I don't typically see after counseling sessions consistently in the way that I see it after healing sessions. So as a Christian, I do genuinely believe in the movement of the Holy Spirit within healing prayer, and we see it, people report it, and it's very visible on their faces when they leave.
Okay. Well, that's great. Well, I appreciate you taking this time to talk with me today and share your thoughts with the parish and whoever else happens to watch these videos.
Yeah.
Any final things do you want to share?
In terms of the parish and in terms of the healing ministry, there is a part of our website that's mqoa.org/healing, where you can learn more about the different types of healing ministry and opportunities that are here on a regular basis.
Yeah. So I'll put a link to the healing website into the description of the video once it's finally posted.
Perfect.
So
All right.
great.
Thank you.
Thank you.